for those of you who don't remember, my name is Gary Goldsand. I'm a clinical ethicist director at the John Doster Health Ethics Center. Very pleased several years ago when Dr. Solas asked me to participate in the course in some way. I had been always somewhat interested in future ethics. I think in the early 1990s it was my interest in the Human Genome Project and my sense that we might need a new sense of ethics to keep up with the new technology that drove me into this field, I think. But it's been a real privilege to be able to listen to the material covered in this course, to have a chance to speculate about future technologies and how they should be used and how they might be used, to contemplate things like the technological singularity, which I think remain hard for anybody by definition to get their head around. And I've always been a believer that it's a good idea to think of such things in advance, that when we contemplate an ethics for a new age, what is it, or what tools might we be able to use? I think the challenges jump out, especially looking forward. You see so much in the news about feeling bad about the future for you guys. For us who are likely to be dead in a few decades, apparently we're going to miss the grief and that you might not. And so I think that in a way, some of what I'm going to discuss today is a revisiting and an elaboration on the initial lecture. And I don't plan to take much more than 40 minutes, so hopefully there's plenty of time for discussion. So you'll remember at the beginning I asked you, is there an issue or two that brought you to the course? And each of you had an answer, so it might be something that we can discuss at the end as we move forward. So this is the key issue, the imminent arrival of technologies that are potentially radically transformative. That aren't just slight changes, but significant changes in what we can do and how we can do it. So some of the questions around that challenge: what do we do to optimize the chances that these changes will be for the better? How can we begin to even answer such a question? And more specifically, what ethical tools are available to us and how shall we wield them? So what are the ethical tools for the future, and how well can we identify them, how well can we use them, and can they serve our needs when these questions become more than merely hypothetical, when we're actually facing them? So you've seen this list before, but I think it bears mentioning out that each one of these presents us with an ethical challenge of sorts, a should we question or a how far should we go question. So designer babies, by that I mean advanced genetics technology that's able to recognize so-called abnormalities in the genes of an embryo or a future baby. And then, no doubt, over the last 20 years, we've done a great deal of, I would say, early tinkering with embryos that enable parents to have healthier children. Generally a very useful and nice service that comes with our exploration of fertility enhancement in general. But with it come the questions that as we're at the stage of potentially being able to look into a very early embryo, just a ball of a few cells, we can look at one of those cells and tell something about the genetics of the future baby, and in some cases think about making some edits, removing things that we think might lead to disease. And it's inevitable that as our technology progresses, it won't only be about preventing future disease, but while we're in there, certain parents are going to ask, can you make some other changes while you're there? Can my kid be a little bit taller, or can you make sure that gets his mother's face, not his father's? But the whole concept of how such a thing should be handled is a great example, because it's highly predictable that individuals by the millions will be interested in maximizing what they see as the good health of their babies, and that's to be weighed against the good within a population. What are the harms? And for much of history thus far, such things would be driven by a willing individual who really wants this, and then a provider who feels that they can do it. So the idea of the outer world having a real say in this is, it's not normally the way things are done, at least in this part of the world. Historically, it was certainly the case that European countries 500 years ago didn't necessarily like when scientists suggested things that challenged religious dogma or ideology. But it's clear that this is a technology that people will be interested in, and that has implications for us all. The implications being, how well do we understand the risks when we start tinkering with genes, which I think any thoughtful person would realize we're just at the very beginning of this. And it's an incredible achievement to be able to identify genes and understand them. But we always have to bring that humility. What is it we might not know about them? Which is when we discussed the Chinese physician who decided to just go ahead and try to do these edits and eliminate HIV. Certainly must have thought that he was probably doing a potentially good thing, and didn't sufficiently consider what might happen. What do we not know about genetic manipulation? And that's why, as you can see, I'm a big fan of precaution in moving forward. So life extension, I think we've had a chance to describe that a fair bit, but it's a similar thing. Loads and loads of individuals will be highly interested in this for themselves and their loved ones. It's pretty easy to build an argument that it threatens incredible social upheaval if all of a sudden our lives were to be extended a great deal, double or triple, just because of the way that we live. I think it might also cause a few challenges among traditionalists. It's our tradition of absolute reverence for life in general, in particular human life, is part of what has driven our desire to embrace and see the sanctity and not want to allow death. And so I am a little curious about how those traditions that say fight against death would respond to the possibility of life extension. Does it become mandatory, or they would have to make some decision about what the religious laws are. So access to beneficial technologies, I think underlying this in our discussions is the recognition of a not yet perfectly just economic system around the world. Not only that, but one that seems to be getting less and less just in terms of fair and equitable distribution of goods. And so I think we always need to keep in mind, at least in this current time, to what degrees might these new technologies just become one more means of exploiting other people. And that fear is real and legitimate. I think the highest hopes are that really advanced technologies that work well will end up closing that gap, possibly by increasing what we can produce. And so enhancement, again, it's similar to the designer babies. When is enough enough? Moral enhancement, physical enhancement. A lot of people like the idea of some measure of perfection, And so one can imagine that if it becomes available, again, there wouldn't just be the odd person involved, interested in enhancing certain qualities. There would be loads and loads of people. And then this other one, I mean, we do talk about the singularity, and I think it's a discussion worth having, especially as we see how technology is going, how artificial intelligence is progressing, and understanding that even the best artificial intelligence so far is really a fancy algorithm, and how well can we program machines to simulate independent behavior. But it's reasonable to project that there will come that time when the computing power is such that it's worth actually letting go, sort of cutting the cord, so to speak, and not merely installing the algorithms in these advanced things, but pressing the button to let them go on their own, to make the whatever systems work with each other and generate new knowledge. And that, I think you can see, is the moment of potential risk. It's probably the case that science fiction has, created these dystopian scenes of the computers taking over that are most likely exaggerated. But again, when we look at the highest hopes for artificial intelligence, that their unbelievable computer power will enable us humans to solve a lot of their problems, comes with those risks. So when can we relinquish control in a real substantial way? And again, we can argue whether that's 10 or 20 years away, 100 years away, or 1,000 years away. In some ways, it doesn't matter. We can start the discussion now, because I don't think we're going to resolve it at any point. So others that I missed, just as I go through this list, if you want to throw out there? Okay. So this curve you've seen, and I just want to revisit it because, the power of exponential growth and what does it really mean, and how much stock can we put in the shape of this curve, that it will continue to rise at a faster and faster rate. Bless you. It is interesting to think, I see that they believe that the wheel was invented 3,500 years ago. And any of you find that a little hard to believe? It just seems to me that a wheel is way older than 5,000 years. Any opinions about that? Again, it's a speculation, but I guess I accept the supposed scientific reality that we haven't fundamentally changed our brains and our abilities in thousands of years, and that it's reasonable to assume that humans 5 and 10 and 15,000 years ago had the brain capacity that we do. And I just think it's pretty hard to go through your life and not notice that round things can roll. So again, just some skepticism when they put specific dates on these. But there are important things, the scientific method, how did that usher in the modern age? What was it about the scientific method that led to technological breakthrough? It was basically the ability to aggregate large amounts of data and see patterns that an individual wouldn't have seen with a smaller amount of data. And so the scientific method, the systematic review of things we suspect might be happening, led to this incredible explosion of knowledge of cause and effect, and how things work. And that's what has led to this state of really high technology. Just 100 years after, there are barely any cars on the road. When you stop and think just about how much technology has arrived in a single century, it's pretty mind-blowing. But I think it is important in looking at the future ethic to at least have rudimentary knowledge of what's come behind us. And you've heard me say, I think that we need to learn from the past in order to develop an ethic from the future. That's in some ways our obligation. Don't blind ourselves to the really loud and lessons that have, I guess, been screamed at us by historical events. When you look at the incredible injustices and slavery and medical experimentation and people treating each other badly. All of them give us lessons for the future, I think. So, they put quantum physics, again, it's, I think most of you are science students, and hopefully you've, had a chance to wrestle with, what quantum theory really implies for our understanding of the universe. I mean, I think we're pretty comfortable with Newtonian physics, that it makes sense to us that, any action will cause a reaction. But when you get to the quantum world and what might be going on microscopically, and how, and attempting to get our heads around these non-intuitive realities of how particles, light can seem like a particle in a wave, and a clear recognition of a subatomic world about which we know very little, and we're probably going to need some new technology to be able to peer into what's really happening. So that's our best scientists are trying to do that. The big colliders where they smash atoms into each other just to see what they can see. When you look at those types of experiments, they do seem pretty, basic. That they're really just playing with their new toy. Let's smash these things together and see what we can see. But when you realize just how tiny the particles that you're talking about are, you can see the size of the challenge. These aren't just small, they are really small. So is the curve inevitable? Because that's, I'm a little worried that maybe it is. I guess I'm hoping that it isn't. So, with that reality, what are our ethical tools? How reliable are they? What risks are worth taking? And how do we evaluate unknown risks? This is, again, building on the discussion we had before. So these are the tools. When I say, what are our tools? Again, they are not highly complicated. I think we humans have been finding a way to get along with each other and make decisions for thousands and thousands of years. And the way that we think is, when facing a decision or an assessment, is almost certainly some version of these things. So I got the impression that last time when I said, do the ends justify the means, you guys were really listening. I'm not sure you were listening to the rest of it, because that's what seemed to come up. But hopefully you recognize that as a representation of the rest of it. So these are the tools. We can proclaim principles, like treat people well, don't harm people, be fair, respect people's opinions, and the idea of using principles to make your decision, as opposed to the other methods, is that you start with those fundamental propositions that we buy into to some degree or other. And it's pretty hard to argue that that fairness around the world isn't a good thing. I mean, those who would argue, against fairness would probably do so out of some naturalistic argument that there are more and less powerful beings, and it's simply our lot as biological beings to exert power over our environment. And that those who believe that everything can be fair and humans can hold hands are some sort of unrealistic dreamers. It's always going to be about power, so I'd rather be the person with it than without it. So in some ways it's a debate between those who are pessimistic about the human future, that we are never going to be able to overcome those things, and the optimists who say, no, we are able to get along. In fact, it's incredible how much peace and prosperity civilization in general has brought, and we just have to keep trying. And so again, I think when you look around the world at political divides, often it is some version of the optimists versus the pessimists, the ones who think, well, we can really get this good, and others that think, no way, there's always going to be bad guys to chase down, so you have to not necessarily try to level the playing field, because it will never get there. So grasping the principles, and so the principles of biomedical ethics, respect for persons, and do good and minimize harm and justice, are just one set of principles. But I think they work well. And so whether you're going into clinical practice or scientific research, I think it's reasonable that those principles underlie the ethical review of research in universities these days. It's a useful system. So the other tool, outcomes-based decision making. So it's pretty hard sometimes to agree on principles universally. That there might always be some who say that other things should be near the top of the list of what we need to consider. So outcomes-based decision-making, which change your system. You don't start your thinking with the principles. You start your thinking with the goal. What is the thing that we're trying to achieve? And coming up with some vision of that, and then working your way backwards from that to the present, indicates some way forward. Again, logical. How do we build it? We want a world where people feel civic and provincial and national pride, but at the same time love and respect everyone around the world. Where people don't die needlessly, where things are generally fair and good. We can imagine some vision of that world. And the whole statement, the ends justify the means, I think gives what I think needs to be the punchline, which is in any good decision about an important thing, you need to look at both the principles that are underlying your decision and the likely outcomes. Okay, when you see craziness in the world, people doing things that are just inexplicable, there's a good chance that they were thinking too much of just the principle or too much of just the outcome. And so an extreme example is I go to the hospital with my mom. They do an initial assessment and say she needs a hospital bed, but unfortunately there are no hospital beds. So all I have to do is a little bit of quick murder, and I can clear some hospital beds, and there'll be one for my mom. Okay, so I get the outcome that I think is good, but the way that I got there is completely unacceptable. So I think to keep in mind that you really need to do both. So just notice when you look at the news in the next little while, you see things that appear to be crazy, but just think, is the person making that decision focusing on one or the other of these things too much? So a good example might be abortion. We know that abortion has been a very controversial issue. There are some that feel that it's just absolutely the wrong thing to do, and some that feel that, well, while it's unfortunate, it's women can decide what to do. And so you see the various things going on in the country south of us. And you know that there's a large constituency of people who care very much about this, and it's resulted in a cutting of funding to certain women's health services by the current government, mainly because it's a way for them to show their displeasure with abortion. They're basically saying any entity that is delivering abortion services or counseling the people they serve about this possibility, that they stand to have their funding cut. Not only in America, but also in Africa and other continents. The reason I use it as an example is that, for sure, the motivation of such people is to try to prevent abortions, to save the people that they think need saving. But when you think about it in the real world, when you cut those services around women's health, it is completely and utterly predictable that more women will become pregnant, because those same entities also provide family planning services. And that the end result of that cut of funds is going to be more abortions in the world. And so I'd say that's a perfect example of a group standing on principle and not looking at how things play out in the real world. So it's a similar debate when you look at arguments about addiction and opiates or illegal drugs. Some that say we should ban them, we should never support them. Others that say we're not going to be able to get rid of them, therefore we should adopt the so-called harm reduction approach. We can't make them stop doing it, but we can prevent them from dying as a result. And that is seen as a reasonable intermediate stage. So again, just the point that an ethic for the future requires both principle and realistic prognostication of outcome. So lingering in the background are important things like the rights of individuals, that which is owed basically to each and every human being. Absolutely a revolutionary concept around the world to say that there are indeed universal human rights, or a sense that at least every human being that's been born on this world is entitled to some basic idea. But I think we also accept that that's a bit utopian. We realize we're not quite there yet, but we'd like to think that we get there. And then narrative ethics. I think it's important that if you just start thinking about principles and outcomes, you might drive yourself a little crazy, because there's a long list of possible principles, and it's hard to predict the outcomes. Narrative ethics asks, what is the story going on? It could be with this individual, with this professional, in this relationship, in this city or this country. It can be sort of a grand societal narrative, one of which might be, in the Western world, that capitalism and free market economics are a great system for producing and exchanging goods and services. And that story is one that has animated how people see the West. But it's also the case that the economic story that we live in is based on an idea of perpetual growth. When you think about what is it that we think should happen when goods and services are produced, that they need to keep growing, and in a lot of ways that's built into our system, that success in any endeavor means that you don't just build something that maintains a level, that it actually has to grow. So I worry that is something that we really need to consider in our relatively recent recognition that we live on a planet that is in fact a finite system. When the fundamentals of free market economics were developed, 100, 200, 300 years ago, they certainly presumed an infinitely large system. One where the resources are endless, and we are slowly recognizing that no, it's very big, our Earth, but it's not infinitely large. 100 factories, would never touch the atmosphere. But take 100,000 factories spewing stuff into the air. We realize that over years, it's a big enough system to change the chemistry of our atmosphere, and that's what we're going through. So the story, and then the story of the individual. Is it in a nuclear family? We are very much in the West embedded in this idea that it's good to have a family, that it's good to have a relationship with parents and siblings. I feel very strongly about it. Willing to say that it's probably good around the world in any and every situation to have parents that love each other raising children. Is that there are places in the world where that isn't necessarily the model? There's still sort of collectives where children are born and raised by the community. And so what sort of story is needed there? I think that we can look at the past and extract some near certain truths, one of which is that every human being needs to be nurtured in a loving environment, and that that's going to pay off when they become adult. So when I think about what are the principles of the future that we might throw out there as possible, it would be things like that. You'll see that as we go forward that I'll have questions. What about things like love and those aspects of human culture that are harder to put your finger on? What is the nature of progress? Is just getting more efficient necessarily a good? Is being able to produce more quickly necessarily a good? Or if it really is the case that human beings have sort of a black heart and no matter what are going to continue to clash with each other and disagree and exert power, you got to really think carefully about the technology that's in their hands, because the difference between today and the past is absolutely the ability to completely obliterate life on the planet. And that's only been a possibility in the nuclear age. So those are the costs. And that's why when we bring in the precautionary principle, I invite you to think about when the costs are infinitely large, how do you factor them into how things should go for the future? And so the bottom line here is I guess foreshadows what I'm going to say in the end, is that we are going to need to forge a middle path through diverging opinions if we hope to get through to the future, because there are very strong opinions around the world about fundamental things, and people will fight about those endlessly. And when the tools in their hand switch from stones to knives to guns to bombs to nuclear bombs, those fights become more and more important. So I'm a big believer that a grand compromise at this state of humanity is absolutely necessary if we hope to make it through another millennium. And all of this, I think is based in what I've argued about the need for intellectual humility, that if there's anything we've learned or been maybe compelled to accept, as we've looked around the world, as technology has enabled us to meet other cultures en masse, we're able to see the patterns of behavior of 1,000 different cultures in the world that each developed. I mean, my initial years of study were around different religions of the world. And, I was interested in the phenomenon. Why do people believe what they believe? How do dominant systems of thought enter a particular place and take over? And when you look around, you see amazing similarities of how humans get together. They rally around an idea. They form a group around that idea, and sometimes that group can grow from local to national to international. And this idea that one of the 1,000 different worldviews of the world is absolutely correct and the others is wrong, it remains a possibility. But I think, that the general sensibility is that around the world we should stop this competition of ideology, precisely because, and I think the one thing we can all agree on is a fundamental uncertainty at the center of our belief. And I think the theist, the classical religious person, can buy into that because you can usually say that, one of the attributes of the divine, of God, is mystery, a whole lot of mystery. I mean, some people will say, well, there isn't, that there was a revelation in this or that book and it solved all the mystery, but most people, I think, can accept the idea that the divine, there is a great deal of mystery there. We don't know exactly what happens. And that common point, an acceptance of just a little bit of uncertainty, I would say, is a core feature of an ethic for the future. If we fail to just create that mode of uncertainty, enable certain ideologies that are going to struggle to say, well, to add a bit of a maybe to their assertions, I think there's a way for them to do that without abandoning their core beliefs. Because I just don't think there are that many people who, left in the world that think ultimately one of these cultures is going to win out and all of us will be the same. That is almost always a dystopian vision in these times. That's what the whole, pretty amazing progress this century in the last 20 years in recognizing and celebrating diversity among humans. You guys, I think, lived it. You probably are young enough that you had people in your elementary and high schools that might have been a little diverse, not necessarily the same. And I would like to think that your generation accepts the value of diversity around the world. So the other things that I've mentioned before that contribute to uncertainty, that we argue about ways of knowing. So the empirical is that which we can see and measure and detect with our senses. We like to see things. They tell us that that's absolutely true and it's there. But we have the whole world of the conceptual, the things that we believe exist but we can't actually see. Things like the mind and the soul. And, we can argue about what are the essences of those all day long, but we're just going to be conceiving of what they might be. We like the empirical. We would love to be able to peer between those atoms and detect where some concept of soul might reside. But for now, we're not able to find that. And so, while I think it's legitimate to really argue about the empirical, what is it we're seeing and what does it mean? When you start arguing about the conceptual things that we construct in our brains, that for people to say, my conception is totally right and yours is totally wrong is not tenable. So infinite complexity is another thing that should underlie or be able to convince people who are perhaps too certain that they ought to have a little bit of doubt. And the simple contemplation of infinity works for that. How far does the universe go? What is the edge of the universe? They've told us my whole life that there was this thing called the Big Bang and that's how it started. That's not satisfactory. So what is outside of that? What did it bang into? What's beyond the edge of that universe? And how far does it go? And then even recent astronomical numbers, like I think 20 years ago you would have heard of the Milky Way galaxy. That's our galaxy, and people would have said, "Oh, there's a lot of stars. There's thousands and thousands." But I've noticed in the last little while it's gone from 1 million stars to 1 billion stars to many, many billions of stars just in our galaxy. But however you cut it, it's this. When you look at the infinite, and what does it mean to have 100 billion stars in a galaxy and 1 trillion galaxies? You can't even begin to get your head around it. So I would challenge anybody who thinks that they're too certain to consider the mystery there in the infinite. And then, like I think I mentioned before, similarly at the same time, there's the infinitely small. That between this space and this space, there aren't 100 points or 1,000 points. There are an infinite number of points. You can get smaller and smaller and smaller. If there are any 2 points, you can always put something in the middle. So that same concept of infinity works in the microscopic world, and I would say is equally an invitation to the acceptance of real mystery, that we humans should get out of this idea, learn from the past that when somebody declared the existence of atoms and that those are the most fundamental particle, it was an innovation, but it wasn't going to last. When you say it's the most fundamental particle, you can't, the question of, well, what would happen if you cut it in half is always there. So my argument here is that we simply can't deny the limitations of our own conceptual abilities. And I think it's easy to do when we understand ourselves as animals. You're not going to ask your dog to do calculus. Why? It's just beyond their capability. So hopefully we can accept that these huge mysteries, we might understand after 1 million years of evolution, but we are to some degree just really fancy animals, and there's no possible way to get our heads around all of that. And like I've said, I think even if you were a god, or a godlike being, whether that is a supernatural divine creature or just some group from another planet that is 1 billion years more advanced than us, and they seem godlike, they'd still have the same problems of what is beyond the infinite, and I can't even imagine how anybody would ever get there. So the next thing are the limitations of language. Clock anywhere.
It's 3 minutes of 3.
Okay. So just the limitations of language. I think a huge amount of conflict in the world is the result of slight misunderstandings of language. That we fail to understand words as metaphorical systems that point towards things, but they aren't necessarily the essence of that thing. And so much misunderstanding comes because we think that a word actually means something, and we don't recognize that somebody else understands a slightly different thing from that word, and you just end up fighting about it. And that, so sometimes in philosophy this is called, the are things, do they have an essence to them? Or not. But I think it's very important that we recognize the limitations of language, and that we might be talking about different things. So what can we really say that we know at this point? Well, it's hard to say. So I've told you about the precautionary principle, that this idea that we should pay attention to unknown risks in planning for the future. And that's one of my contentions. So what have we learned from the past thus far? You can just sort of pull out the grand things that scream out. If you look at slavery or Holocaust, or to a certain degree, a few centuries of colonialism among Europeans, and what is it that some of the things that we've learned? We've learned a lot about what human beings are capable of. We've learned that when they seem to be capable of extremely negative acts, they're usually driven by some sort of ideology, almost certainly an ideology that they are more confident in than they ought to be, which is what justifies the oppression of the other. And so if anything, we can also look at history and learn a great deal about what seems to be human nature, that we have a natural xenophobia. We're afraid of the other, however that presents itself, potentially. You know, we can see how much fear of the other is used as a motivational tool, especially by those in politics, you know. Because that's another thing we learned from history, that if you can get your electorate in this amazing thing called democracy to fear something more than believe in something, you're likely to get their vote. So little things like that. You know, and so avoiding tragedy, you know, meaning self-induced catastrophe is worth pursuing. It's absolutism and universalism that I think have become the problem. You know, and that is just our inheritance, that some of our traditions, you know, have been received, you know, always in the real world, always in competition with some other ideology, with whom, in the process of that competition, they demonized each other. You can just think of any two entities, whether it's, you know, sects within a religion or something, that, you know, the minute there's that divide, there's the creation of the other, and the fight can go on forever. So I guess I'm saying if there's any lesson from the past screaming out, it's to not be absolute in our beliefs, and not to be universal, because we shouldn't be confident enough about any one of them. And then, so I think what I'm getting at is the ethic for the future needs to be a pluralistic ethic. That all of us who feel bound by things we know have to be able to step back and recognize that there might be uncertainties, and that opens the door for the middle path and compromise and a true pluralism. So the ethics for the future, you know, that's, like I said, the slippery slope is a real thing, that our sensibilities can evolve over time, or some might say erode over time. So it is, you know, in the whole discussion of medical assistance in dying, you know, a pretty common discussion in Canada in recent years. I think almost everybody can accept that there's the odd person, you know, who the rest of their life, because of their physical condition, is just going to be terrible, and you can justify it. But the slippery slope is a real concern, that over time, the minute we say it's okay for some humans to be relieved of life, there will inevitably be others who step up and say that, you know, my suffering is as bad as theirs, therefore I should also be able to be relieved of life. So beware of the slippery slope and evolving sensibilities. You know, when I look at accounting for unforeseeable consequences, the precautionary principle, and just how much weight should we put in it, you know, I'm very worried. You know, I think you've heard me say a few times things like, you know, what's the rush? You know, if we progress more quickly than we imagine, you know, there's still going to be the question of what then, and how do we fill our days? Which is why I would like to think that we can really go step by step, especially when wielding these technologies that we don't understand. And that the necessity of growth, as quickly as possible, that's animated the economic world, you know, if we just let it go unfettered, people will be pushing forward and probably pushing the limits, and I would argue exposing us to risks that they don't know exist, partly because they're in that competitive race to get to some unknown spot, which, of course, you never actually get there, you know, unless the singularity is real. So the next things, I think I've said in some ways, that the eternal questions don't go away. Why are we here? What is the purpose of human life? To what degree do we individuals, you know, bond with others and groups, and what should it be? Those are eternal questions. I would like to think that patience about progress is a reasonable way forward. So when I look at new technologies and those who might regulate them, things like starting to cut up genes and tinker with stuff that we don't understand. I would love to see us slow down and always be aware of potential unknown risks, so that in our enthusiasm for the next discovery, what a tragedy it would be if it's all accidental. It would almost be better if you had an evil person concoct a universal flu that killed everybody than for such a flu to be created accidentally by somebody. And when we're working in the laboratory with microscopic things, viruses and stuff we don't understand, that's another huge danger. It isn't only nuclear war, it's also inadvertent disease, it's possible catastrophe, it's solar flare, things that can change all of a sudden. So I'm working towards, I guess, an argument for reasonable, provisional, cross-cultural grand narratives. I think that we can develop such things, that they already do exist, and that historical, sort of enemies or adversaries can overcome that by adopting a common narrative. So you would look at England and Ireland. When I was a little kid, there were bombs going off all over England because of the Irish were very unhappy. It was a serious war between what seems like petty differences, Catholic and Protestant. But in my lifetime, they've shown that can get a whole lot better, and I think it serves as an inspiration. Not even to mention the Second World War, and the Germans were the absolute mortal enemy. And it's pretty interesting how that conflict was able to be resolved and the enemies became allies in a real sense within decades. That's probably a lesson to be attended to. And so pluralism and diversity and the good are what we need to pursue. Just a few last points. The evolving definition of necessity. I don't know if you remember an Ian Kerr's article. Actually, I'm not sure if it was the same article as I gave you. He basically said that, I think it was that war article that I sent to. The problem is we will do things that are necessary, and when it comes to technological progress, the idea that the other guy is getting ahead creates this sense of necessity. That I must do this because if I don't, the other guy is going to. And it's that sense that's going to drive us ahead too quickly. Murphy's Law, I don't know when anything that can go wrong will go wrong. When you drop a piece of toast on the floor that you've buttered, it will land butter side down. That's Murphy's Law. I don't know if any of you, does the toast always land butter side up for you? I know, well, I worry about that attitude because some people think that it's never going to happen. But one day you will, almost inevitable. So just these few other things. I've talked a little bit about what does progress look like. I'm not sure there really is moral progress. The economics of growth, I think you need to understand that in trying to process how are these things likely to play out. And we can't forget that all of this might become moot if the Greenland ice shelf slides into the sea and all of a sudden the sea level goes up by a foot overnight. Then all of us in the world will probably have other things to worry about for a whole bunch of years. So an ethic for the future, I think in the end an ethic for the future is the same ethic as in the past. It's an ideal that we're trying to implement, but only with some measure of success. These remain ideals. The urgency of implementing a good ethic of positive getting along is different now, though, because the power of our tools creates a threat to all of us. And it looks like climate change, whether it's 50 years or 500 years, is going to cause major upheaval. So it's just an argument towards a true pluralism, that it's the only way forward. We need to fight to somehow achieve that, and that we are going to have to seek middle paths and compromise to get along in the world. So what do you guys think? Those are the slides.
Okay.
So when does it fit in society to throw the precautionary principle like out of the window, and as well as unforeseeable consequences, like in the race for the creation of the atomic bomb between the Germans and then the Allied countries? Like, the unforeseeable consequences are huge, and yet two bodies were fully like the governments were investing in it, scientists were working on it, like where was the ethics there?
Well, to do the descriptive ethics of why did that happen, I think it's a perfect example of the reason it happened was completely and utterly because we have to get there before the other guy. And so what might have been seen as an optional good to pursue becomes an absolute necessity, because if they get it first, they're gonna, the fear says that they're going to use it against you. So that's the danger, that the race is going to drive people to change their definition of necessity. What was previously optional is no longer optional. So when you look at, and so that absolutely is still going on in the world in the nuclear standoff, that we're sitting there, that 7 or 8 countries have these weapons. Understandably, some others think that that's unfair and want them. And then you hear among those that have them, well, we do have these 3,000 big bombs we can't use, but the other guy is developing all of these new little fancy bombs, we better catch up. And so that's what still drives this idea. 20, 30 years ago, we imagined that nuclear disarmament was possible. That there were real talks about it, and but that hasn't gone anywhere.
So much of what you talk about here is the language, the words, and so if in 2050 we're communicating by thoughts, would that make things much worse? Would it be a solution to a lot of things? Because presumably you can communicate feelings or broad intent without necessarily having to put it in words, right? If you're conveying thoughts directly. And it would change everything, just as quantum supremacy will also change everything. But maybe it could quickly change things for the better. So if part of what this course is trying to do is to kind of shape the world in a positive way, so how could you categorize things when you're communicating by thought that leads to a better world than the world of today when we're using words, It's an interesting challenge.
Well, I imagine that if we were to somehow be able to link up thought to thought, there's a chance that overcomes the limitations of language.
Yes.
But there's also the possibility that even thought to thought, that we misunderstand each other.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know how that might work.
Yes.
But I think in some ways your point speaks to the ongoing, everlasting human reality that we are individuals walking through the world, in some ways completely isolated from every other individual, longing for some sort of reunion. When do we feel best? When we are somehow communing with the other person, whether it's love or friendship or whatnot. And so I think when you imagine telepathy, that it would be a deeper, more profound, genuine
Right.
connection.
Yep.
But if you take it too far, it becomes dystopian because the individual disappears and we still like individuals.
But I think that's just half of it, that there are substantial numbers of people fantasizing about solitude, and they really mean it, even though like they have friends who never fantasize about solitude, never want to be alone. They're everything positive for them always involves another person. One of the Twitter quotes yesterday was an actress whose name I forget, a young woman saying she's in a relationship with herself. She's not single because that causes the wrong sort of attention. She's just in a relationship with herself.
When we look in the mirror, we all are.
Yes, yes. And so, to some extent, we find ourselves going round in circles, and there probably are potential ways out of that. I mean, they go beyond just communicating in words. Like when we have machines that are approaching artificial general intelligence, at some point we'll be able to kind of have conversations with them, right? And they're going to suggest things we haven't thought about, just like computers playing Go have positioning of players on the board that no human had ever thought of and are much more beautiful than any human playing. So that idea of truly learning novel things from sentient machines when they exist, that's another source of hope, potentially. If we are motivated in the right way, there are all these things that human beings can't solve up until now. We don't really want to relinquish control to machines, particularly because that's an unpredictable outcome. But maybe they can give us the answers to these things we haven't been able to solve, and they might like that too. And so, yeah, they're just a bunch of things you can think of that are like the acceleration in machines playing Go, or machines doing other things that actually benefit us in a very substantial way.
Maybe it ends up being another type of celebration of diversity.
Yeah.
A recognition among humans that other entities have value. I think that we realize that we can't communicate effectively, but between dolphins, whales, and elephants, and some dogs, they seem to be pretty smart. And we have to entertain that question that the alien life we imagine that's out there
Right.
might be right here. And it's the language barrier that prevents us from
Yeah,
from
and in
communicating.
terms of what machines and robots can do, there's a point that we reached at this class that was very interesting. None of these students saw the IBO robot when it was doing anything interesting, because they were so absorbed with their phones and so on, and the robot's battery life was so short that this term, none of them saw anything interesting. They could see it on video for pastimes. And so now there's a new IBO, which will be out in 2020. So we're seeing sort of in this class, there's kind of a generational shift here in robot intelligence from the same company. It's all Sony. And so this was the first time ever. What used to happen when I brought that dog is every single student would look up, they'd be engaged, but it's become so ordinary, I think, and the dog itself is more limited in how much it can do during a given period of time. But the new one is much more like a real dog, and its fears are much more realistic. I mean, it stops being curious entirely if it's afraid of falling. If it's near the edge of something or is up very high, it stops being curious. It just waits to be brought into a safe environment, and then it can be curious again. So it's a lot of things that were sort of true of the previous dog from 2004 will be really true in 2020. And you can imagine, okay, it won't end then. In the lives of these students, this new 2020 Sony Idaho dog that I'm now praising will be found to be flawed in a variety of ways, and then there'll be a new generation that's, much better than that. And eventually, like the initial promise was that the dog tells you that he loves you, he never says anything unkind, In a way, it was an ideal friend, just a simple one. So it could become complicated enough that you could really love that dog, right? I mean, he's better than the humans around you. Yeah? So.
Yeah, I don't know, I think.
Not you necessarily.
Well, but
one could, not necessarily
well,
Gary Goldsand.
but it requires a suspension of disbelief.
Yes.
That
Sure it does.
Which is not hard for us to generate.
Yeah.
But so maybe the diversity of the future will be whales and elephants will be a part of our community, as well as the advanced general AI. We'll all get along and see the worth in each other. But I guess the real goal is to encourage you guys to think about this stuff, that it isn't going to be straightforward. And so hopefully you get to keep thinking about it. And,
so one thing you're likely not thinking about is the news, the radio news, right? Because celebrities and young people don't listen to the news. You share that with practically every famous person. They're much too busy to ever listen to the news. Maybe they have some lackey whose job is to listen to the news and then, interpret. So it's quite interesting to think, what are you missing? And is it possible you're really not missing anything? It seems to be that it is possible that although all the old people around you are spending time listening to the news, and they're thinking that because the radio stations know there's hardly anybody listening in the main demographic, the news is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. It used to be 5 minutes, 3, 1 minute, so on. But are you missing out? Are you going to be blindsided by something? Suppose that you really aren't. What does that mean? That all of these things that people are hanging on is, this is the news of the day, which you don't know about because you don't listen to the news. It turns out that wasn't relevant to anything. I mean, it was a thing to think about, but nobody suffered who didn't know about that, right?
I think I see my desire to consume news as a curse. So if you're blessed by being able to ignore the news, I would say embrace that.
Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have a wonderful reading week, and those of you who have not conveyed to me the subject of your project or the day that you wish to speak, please let me know that. But anyway, I'm looking forward to your presentations. There's a medical student who's coming on the 19th, and he may keep coming for the student presentations, so I know it always seemed fake, right? I tell you that we get members of the general public coming and it's always just you, right? So anyway, it'll be cool if we are able to bring a larger audience, which we can. So there used to be a Toastmasters in CSIS. They met right after our class, and this medical student who was in Toastmasters saw us setting up with the cameras and all the lights, all this stuff. And he became fascinated. So he saw me in the hall. We had a long, detailed conversation about the course and you guys and the possibility of coming on the 19th for the last presentation there, and then the student presentations afterwards. So anyway, whether or not he keeps coming, I am looking forward to your presentations. So anyway, have a great reading week.